My name's Elizabeth Hill. I'm Chair of the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney and kind of running this morning's panel. But I particularly want to thank the Chair of the conference, Paul Oslington, for his invitation to organise this session. And I really want to acknowledge his efforts to broaden the intellectual agenda at this year's conference. So thanks, Paul. Care and social reproduction are, of course, essential activities of the economy with important implications for well-being and productivity, and are quite rightly the subject of economic inquiry. They have, however, been located at the fringe of the discipline, not least because they are activities predominantly performed by women and are unpaid. But in the last 3 decades, there has been a burgeoning of scholarly interest in care and social reproduction, its economic value, its distribution between men and women, its impact on labour force participation and growth, and the operation of new markets in what were previously household services, things such as childcare, aged care, disability care, cooking, cleaning, etc., have come to the fore. So the care economy, as it is called in the literature, is now a subject of its own investigation. And there's a large and vibrant international association of feminist economics and a very successful journal of the same name that covers many of these issues, both within Australia and globally. The growth in scholarship and even public policy on these questions has been led by some leading feminist economists, people such as Marilyn Waring from New Zealand, Nancy Folbra, Julie Nelson from the US, Diane Elson from the UK, Beena Agarwal from India, and Rhonda Sharp from here in Australia, along with many others. And all of these women have contributed to the development of a robust body of literature that has refined how we think about the economy, what we count as work, and what we value as productive. And the promotion of well-being for all has often been one of the central concerns of this literature. So we're very fortunate in our panel this morning to have 3 leading scholars on the economics of care who will address some of the more pressing contemporary theoretical and policy questions in this domain. So in order to run today's panel, we've got the 3 speakers. I'm going to introduce them prior to them presenting their talk, and then after about 15 minutes, draw them to a close and open the floor for questions, rather than saving questions to the end, because the 3 papers are quite different. So, opening our session is Professor Paul Dalziel and Professor Carolyn Saunders. They're from Lincoln University in New Zealand. Paul is Professor of Economics and Deputy Director of the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit at Lincoln Uni. His research focuses on economic and social policy under the general heading of wellbeing economics. He and his AERU director, Carolyn Saunders, published a New Zealand book on wellbeing economics in 2014, and they're currently preparing an international version of that book for the Palgrave Pivot series in the UK, and this is what provides the context for his contribution to this panel. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you indeed for those words of welcome, and I am a visitor to Sydney, so let me begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting. I honour their sacred places and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also acknowledge the director of the AERU, my boss, Caroline Saunders, who would have loved to have given this talk but has to be somewhere else today and sends her apologies. So, 15 minutes, I'm going to do these 3 things. I'm going to introduce Marilyn Waring and some of the thoughts she had about the economics of care in 1988. I want to explain that those insights are still relevant today, and I want to suggest that wellbeing economics offers an alternative way forward where we can break down some of the dualities that have existed in our profession. So this is Marilyn Waring today, and Caroline and I wrote an article just published in Feminist Economics paying tribute to her book of 1988. This is Marilyn Waring nearly 30 years ago. See if you can spot her. It's a photo of the National Party caucus, the party in power between 1975 and 1984, when Marilyn Waring was either one of two women or the only woman in that caucus over that 9-year period. She said in her first speech to Parliament that she was committed to advancing the interests of youth and women, and one of the issues that she was particularly focused on is the topic of today's seminar, which was affordable childcare. But she found that she could make no progress on this because the men in her caucus would say that is a private matter and our focus is on economic growth. We've got to get the economy to grow and then we'll think about social policies, private matters like childcare. Waring didn't become a member of Cabinet during her 9 years in Parliament, but she was appointed chair of the Public Expenditure Select Committee in 1978, her second term. So this is a very powerful select committee in the parliamentary system. And the following year, it just happened that New Zealand revised its national accounts, a substantial revision, using the latest version of the United Nations system of national accounts. And as chair of the Public Expenditure Select Committee, that work came under the orbit of Marilyn Waring. And she was intrigued. And she would ask questions like, why do you define work to exclude the work performed in households? And can you get me a copy of the manual where these rules come from? And her official said, no, we don't actually have a copy in New Zealand. And there wasn't one in Australia at that time, she tells me, either. So, these are pre-internet days. This is what she found. As well as the dismissal of the environment came evidence of the severe invisibility of women and women's work. As a politician, I found it virtually impossible to prove that childcare facilities were needed. Non-producers, housewives, mothers, who are inactive and unoccupied cannot currently be in need. So these are the questions asked at the time. What is your occupation? Housewife, unoccupied. So Marilyn Waring, the Prime Minister and her didn't get on particularly well, so he was quite keen for her to be out of the country as often as she could. So she would travel to countries here, there and everywhere she went, she said, I want to speak to somebody my own age and ask her about how she spends her day. And what she found again and again was women commonly engaged in 16 to 18 hours of work a day that were unrecorded in the national accounts and therefore overlooked in economic policy. And that had been her experience in New Zealand. She couldn't make progress on these issues because it was defined not to be part of economic policy. Marilyn Waring left politics in 1984. There's a whole story around that she is writing up at the moment. And so, as I say, pre-internet age, she went to New York to have a look at the source material herself. And she was an individual, but she was an individual working within a community of scholars. So she was hosted at the Institute for Research on Women and the Eagleton Institute of Politics in New Brunswick on the other side of the Hudson River, and found there in the source material the material that she then developed into her book, If Women Counted. This was its title in the international edition, and Counting for Nothing, which was its title in New Zealand and in Canada. To sum up, it's a dense book, but to sum up, she argued that the United Nations system of national accounts was an example of applied patriarchy. So she went into Parliament in 1975. That was the International Year of Women sponsored by the United Nations. Second wave feminism, she was thoroughly imbued in that literature, in that community. And so this is a key quote. The laws of economics and those that govern the national accounts are creations of the male mind and do not reflect or encompass the reality of the female world. So here are the designers of the UNSNA, the English ones anyway, and think, is that applied patriarchy? I was talking to Alex Milmo yesterday, and he says Colin Clark, he's writing the biography of Colin Clark at the moment. Colin Clark was infamous for extreme views on men were in the public sphere, women were in the private sphere. So it's not a long bow to draw to say that attitudes like that were part of the atmosphere within which the United Nations system of national accounts were first designed. There have been changes since then. Of course, the Beijing Platform for Action was an important event globally for promoting changes in the system of national accounts. The Accounting for Women's Work project did a lot of work in a lot of countries. The Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, the Stiglitz, Sen and Fitoussi Commission in France, gave a lot of recognition to this issue. The rules themselves set by the United Nations have been modified, and in particular they have encouraged statistical agencies to prepare satellite accounts to protect the core, as it's called, of the system of national accounts, but allowing a wider look at some of these issues. And it's worth reminding ourselves just how significant unpaid work is compared to the measured economy. So this is from the United Kingdom, and the top line is £1.8 trillion of GDP at the moment in that country. And the estimate of gross value added from unpaid work, and these are all the categories down the right-hand side, childcare is the largest one, is just over £1 trillion. So, there are whole ministries devoted to much smaller shares of GDP. We've got to improve well-being by improving this performance, but we can improve well-being by improvements here. This is Marilyn Waring's point. This should be part of policy at the highest level because it's such an important part of human well-being. And indeed, Waring's critique remains valid, so that core measure of gross domestic product explicitly excludes 6 services provided by household members for consumption within the same household, and that includes 4 that might be called care, the subject of this session today. Now, Waring's argument in her book was that is actually constructing reality in a particular way, that the definitions are not reflecting reality, but are creating it to say this is what we define to be economics, and this is what we define to be non-economic, to be taken care of in other parts of the government. In fact, at the conference dinner last night, one of my fellow diners, we had a conversation about just this point. And he talked about the arrangements within his own household and said it's got nothing to do with economics. And, if we know the literature, we know about, love at home, pay at work. But I said, are you telling me there are no resources being allocated subject to constraints and that there are no opportunity costs from the choices that are made? And he said, no, they're everywhere in this discussion. He says, well, how can you tell me that's not economics? And he said, well, because there's no money involved. Now, that construction of reality is a construction of reality, but deeper, economics, allocation of resources under constraint, recognising the opportunity costs in every choice we make, are fundamental to these questions of care, whether they take place within a hospice or within a household. And that was Marilyn Waring's point 27 years ago. And these things are so genderly structured that it becomes an important question of social justice as well as a question of economics. So these are UK data from their 2 latest time use surveys, and women are spending twice as many minutes per day as men in childcare, depending on the age of their children. And there's been some changes between the 2 surveys, but not a lot. In fact, the amount of men's involvement in childcare for primary school age children has gone down. This is Australia and New Zealand, just for comparisons, and again it's twice as much of non-committed time. Committed time is sleep and personal grooming. The rest of the time, 40% in committed work, essentially within the household and volunteer activities. In New Zealand, the ratio is slightly less, but still dominated towards women. And economists have looked at that. Gary Becker is the standout person in this space. And he is sorry that this is the outcome, but more or less concludes it's inevitable. You just need a small amount of discrimination against women in labour markets, or a small amount of what he calls biological differences in child-rearing skills, to get this huge difference in the allocation of childcare within the household. So that's from his Nobel Prize speech. And it's not just Gary Becker. There's a lot of work, and not just economists, arguing the same point. Small differences can make big changes in this space. That's been challenged, of course. This is the wonderful essay by Nancy Folbra and Heidi Hartman, published in the same year that Marilyn Waring wrote her book, talking about the rhetoric of self-interest and ideology and gender in different branches of economic theory. And I want to finish by suggesting that well-being economics could provide an alternative to break down some of this duality between economics. Professor Carol Graham introduced the science of well-being economics in the opening keynote address at this conference, a wonderful overview of that science. And she made several references to the OECD's wellbeing framework. She was part of the sounding board that provided input into the design of that. This is the conceptual framework, as they call it, where individual wellbeing has these 10 measures of objective well-being plus room for the subjective well-being that Professor Graham talked about. And all I want to do here is just say that work-life balance is one of those indicators of objective well-being. So there's no excuse anymore. This is at the heart of what we understand by well-being, and we've got every reason to understand differences in that work-life balance question between genders. In 2014, Caroline Saunders and I looked at wellbeing economics in a policy setting with a New Zealand context in particular. We've now been asked to write for the Palgrave Pivot series. Joe Saunders is a young philosopher from the University of Leeds. He's joined us on the authorship team, a very useful addition. And the opening chapter includes 3 foundational propositions. And the first one, I don't think anybody will disagree with. Economists have long said the primary purpose of economics is to contribute to enhance well-being of persons, and I haven't met an economist who disagrees with that statement. But typically the second sentence is, and the best way we can do that is by getting economies to grow faster, and that becomes the focus of economics. In contrast, we want to say well-being is enhanced by expanding the capabilities of persons to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. A direct connection between economics and well-being. This is the eudaimonic conceptualization of well-being that Professor Graham highlighted in her address. She said it was the favourite of her 4 measures of subjective well-being, and I agree. It draws on the work particularly of Amartya Sen, the capabilities approach, going back a long way really. In 1999, his Development is Freedom book wrote, "Attention is thus paid particularly to the expansion of the capabilities of persons to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value." And we've taken that phrase for our own proposition too. In a way, this is the subjective idea of well-being. So we ask people, what do you value? But we don't leave it at that. People must be able to explain reasons for the value that they place on the kind of life they are living, and that's the objective measures. To take care of things where in some societies women have no voice to answer that question, or have come to accept the pedagogy of the oppressed that education is not for women. So objective measures need to be incorporated as well in this reason to value. So the third one is the capabilities of persons are expanded by different types of capital investment at different levels of human choices. I'm not going to talk about the different types of capital investment. That would take 18 minutes of its own. But the different levels of human choices, we start with persons making choices. That includes forming households and families, where a lot of this care conversation is taking place. Civil society, the market participants, local government, central government, and then the global community. And that's essentially the chapters of the book, where we try to integrate all of those choices being made to understand how we can improve well-being by investments in different types. So, 2 final influences on our thought. Going back to Marilyn Waring, she makes a lot of emphasis on time use choices. I've already put up some time use surveys data, but she says things like, time is the one unit of exchange we all have in equal amounts, the one investment we all have to make. So that has influenced her work a great deal. And this is Professor Catriona McKenzie, Professor of Philosophy at Macquarie University, and she's written a lot around the theme of relational autonomy, about agency within communities. And addressing the question of whether outsiders should ever intervene within a culture, she writes, if the cultural or religious practices of particular communities can only be sustained by perpetuating women's subordination and stunting their capacities for autonomous agency, then liberals and democratic theorists cannot consistently accommodate the demands made by such communities. Now, drawing on Marilyn Waring again, she just replaces that first bit with economic. If our economic systems, our ways of measuring things can be sustained only by perpetuating women's subordination, and we talk quite regularly about the motherhood tax the motherhood benefit exactly, then this cannot be perpetuated. So the final slide, 2 more foundational propositions. Our unit of analysis, a person's able to make time use choices they reason will promote well-being, influenced by their own cultural values and constrained by personal abilities and social capabilities. I think it's a very rich way for entering into well-being, integrating personal choices, household choices, civil society and the economy before we get to government. And then proposition 8, that should be obvious, but Gary Becker didn't accept it. He said it was just unfortunate the way things turned out. But men and women should have equal capabilities for well-being. If not, this is a matter for public policy. If not, it's a matter for public economic policy. So, in the Indigenous language of my own country, kia ora tātou katoa, may you and I, all of us together, enjoy well-being. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paul. What a fabulous opening to this session. A couple of things for me. Marilyn Waring's work was very influential on me as an undergraduate, and I based my honours thesis in 1992 around her work. So it's lovely to kind of hear that that story retold and the links that you make then to the questions that remain outstanding for us even now. And the other thing that I really appreciate was your ending on the issue of time use data. And there's the ABS cut Australian funding for the Time Use Survey,
yes.
And we haven't had one since 2006. There's a lot of feminist economists and other feminist scholars who are pushing the government to reinvest in Time Use Survey, and at the moment there's an additional kind of push. So we can only hope and continue to make the argument as to why time use data is essential for the making of economic policy here in Australia. So I'll open up now for some questions for Paul. If you just raise your hand, and then Hannah will bring a microphone so that your voice is recorded for the recording of the session.
No, they want to hear the next one.
Paul.
Just behind you, Paul.
Thanks, Hannah. Hannah's one of our volunteers who's been very, very wonderfully taking the microphone around all of these sessions to facilitate discussion. So thanks, Hannah. So I want to ask a question about whether you can quantify this. I have a PhD in econometrics, and I don't do a lot of econometrics these days, but I still am one for. If we can quantify it, it kind of makes it a lot more palatable, a lot more usable, a lot easier for people like Treasury to pick it up. But I wonder whether there's some way that you can formalise and quantify this argument that you're going to get more impact on well-being from reforms in this area than you are from some other area, where there's some sort of measure of a marginal increment to well-being from reforms in various areas. I'm just kind of thinking vaguely aloud.
Yep.
But is there a way of making that argument a bit more robust and quantitative?
Yes, well, look, I think work of scholars like Professor Carol Graham are showing how the econometrics and the wellbeing literature can be brought together. It's an emerging field, I would say that, and different measures of subjective well-being are being used as the dependent variable, and all sorts of factors are being put as independent variables influencing differences in reported subjective well-being. The other indicator that's sometimes used in some studies are end-of-lifetime wealth, so disparities between the wealth owned by men, the wealth owned by women, and the impact that different arrangements have on that measure. There is a lot of work on that space. The motherhood penalty is probably the Google search that you want to do. So people have done econometric measures of that if I become a father, there is a significant and measurable increase in my economic well-being. I'm more likely to be employed, I'm more likely to be given a promotion at work, but if my wife becomes a mother, it's the opposite. She's less likely to be employed forever, and she's less likely to be promoted, less likely to end up with the same income as I at the end of our 2 careers. So that's where the work has been.
Over here.
Thanks. Can I play devil's advocate
Sure.
a moment and defend Gary Becker? Right. His point surely is that it's that the gains from trade
Yes.
within a household increases the well-being of both as
Yes.
gains from trade.
Yes.
Will otherwise the trade would not take place.
Yes.
It's a very naive view of power. I'm the first to admit it, but it is
Yes.
the classical neoclassical economist view of any trade.
Yes,
You know,
yes. No, that's exactly his position. So, and we go back to the motherhood penalty. So a woman who chooses to get married with an idea of starting a family starts here, and the man starts here, and as a result of the trade, she's here and the man are here. And he stops. Whereas I'm saying, well, it shouldn't stop, because as a society, we should not agree with an outcome where the well-being of women is systematically below the well-being of men. There's more work to be done. And so, yes, let's take those gains from trade. I don't want to denigrate that achievement or to say he should not have been given the Nobel Prize for those insights, but there's more work to be done. And more work has been done. I think the world that Gary Becker was writing in is quite different from the work that our children are growing up into now. Thank goodness.
Other questions?
Just to your right.
Suppose
Yeah.
that the system of national account is revised
Yes.
and all the time spent inside the house have got the imperial value
Yes.
taken in. And so now the GDP is increased by 50% or maybe doubled.
Yes.
What difference will that make in day-to-day business of the families?
Okay, so David Cameron, when he launched the wellbeing program in the United Kingdom, said economic growth is the foundation of all our aspirations. Why is the Australian government not funding the Time Use Survey? Because it had to balance the books in order to stimulate economic growth, and that was one of the sacrifices, the nice-to-haves that had to be sacrificed sometime in the future. So the whole mechanisms of government are engineered so that the Prime Minister can say, we achieved this strong economic growth in our last term, and we promise to deliver this in our next term. What is measured is what gets managed. So the impact would be that the key indicator of successful performance in government would be broadened to include what is going on within households. And the flow-on effects there would be the difference that people would see within the households. So just, we spend all of that effort about how can we make work easier and more productive because it leads to economic growth. So that same sort of question, how much training can we put into parents, fathers and mothers to improve well-being? It's just off the radar screen because it's not part of our measurement system. I think that's the Stiglitz et al. Commission.
And it keeps
insight.
governments from funding universal childcare. Whereas if we had an alternative set of metrics, we'd actually see that as a productive investment.
Yeah, well, governments don't fund anything. They collect taxes that are then used to fund
That's right, well, that's
childcare.
right.
So we would fund childcare
Yes.
in a more equitable manner.
It would be
Yeah.
politically palatable. Okay, I'm going to
Thank you very
call the
much.
time there. Thanks
Yep.
so much, Paul. Let's thank him for his intervention. So our next speaker is Professor Gabrielle Maher from Macquarie University. Gabrielle is Head of Department of Sociology at Macquarie. Her research engages with problems in social policy and the world of work. And these themes come together in her research on the way social care services are organised. She works with colleagues in Australia and in Sweden to understand how policies to make markets in social services are transforming the welfare states in these two countries. So welcome, Gabrielle.
Thanks very much, Liz, and thanks very much for the invitation to this, to participate in this panel. Just in relation to the topic of Paul's talk, I can warmly recommend the work of Patricia Apps for those who are interested in a kind of new household economics that addresses a lot of these issues extremely rigorously and powerfully. Okay, so feminist economists have emphasised the characteristics of care that make it different from many other services. Specifically, they've talked about care involving the formation of a relationship between the person providing care and the person receiving it, and that care recipients need assistance, either because they're yet to be able to care for themselves or have lost some or all of their ability to do so. And that my focus is going to be on formal care services, that is, services such as childcare, disability support and care for older people, provided by paid workers, typically employed by public or private sector organisations. And as merit goods, these services are publicly funded to a significant extent, or collectively funded, perhaps, to take Paul's point. Now, the quality of formal care services and how they're organised are important for many reasons related both to economic growth and human well-being. They include the potential to enhance women's employment opportunities by offering an efficient substitute for unpaid household provision, and to enhance the quality of human capital, particularly in the case of childcare and disability support. But to fulfil their potential, these services need to be accessible, affordable and attractive, that is, of good quality. And the quality of services is connected to the quality of jobs in these services, and also to people's willingness to use them and to work in providing them. So I'm not going to talk about that, but there's a lot of interesting work, and I could refer you to it, about the problem of the care deficit, who's going to do care work into the future, and how that's connected to the generally poor working conditions in these industries. So in Australia, the share of employment in these industries is growing quite rapidly. You can see here. This is the two industry subdivisions of social assistance services. And you can see there that particularly what's called other social assistance services, which is another terrible problem with the ABS data, that there is no further division. We can't track employment in disability support, in home care for older people, or even in childcare separately, because they're just not reported. They're all bundled into this category, social assistance services, other. I've unbundled it a little bit for your information. These are the main things. It includes a childcare, community aged care and other social assistance. So now nearly, one in 30 people in Australia are employed in providing these services now. And I want to look at some critical issues in the policy strategies that are driving this growth and the institutional arrangements that are being put in place. Are these policies and arrangements setting Australia up well to reap the benefits to growth and well-being that these services have the potential to bring? And I'm going to look at some evidence and arguments about what happens when governments rely on markets and private provision to deliver care. And here we've got some brief excerpts from the federal government's messaging on aged care and disability support reforms in recent years. And they give a clear sense of the kinds of institutional arrangements they're seeking to establish. So in aged care, we've got a market-based system in which competition is going to drive high quality and innovation. Same sorts of thing in disability support. They want to create, the NDIS wants to create a vibrant and competitive supply of services, lower barriers to entry, draw in for-profit providers and so on. And on both policies, they're also talking about empowering consumers and getting away from a welfare-style model to a much superior market-style model in the government's parlance. Now, even before this announcement, these announcements that were in the last couple of years, the share of for-profit provision was already high and growing in several care fields, and it is set to continue growing, particularly in disability support and aged care, with the sorts of reforms the government's put in place very recently. So you can see there that long day care was climbing until the crash of ABC Learning in 1988 and has still settled on about 2/3 for-profit provision. Growth in the share of for-profit provision in residential aged care is just on a steady increase and the home care packages, which have only recently come to be taken up by for-profit companies, that's also on a growth path. So what happens when care goes to market? When this relational activity through which the needs of people at their most vulnerable are met is organised through provision for profit, consumer choice and provider competition, underpinned by public subsidies, and that's quite important. We do actually know quite a lot about what happens. The design of the market is really important, as Julia Gillard mentioned in a speech she gave to the Commonwealth. I can't remember the exact name of it, in the Commonwealth, the High Commission in London in 2008 when she was the Education Minister, focusing on the fundamentals of market design. How can we develop markets that interact productively with strong public institutions and empower users to participate successfully in them? She promptly forgot that the design of markets is really important. If you think about the design of the VET market, for example, that she went on to set up, or the current market that's being established in disability services. Now, I'm not going to explore in theoretical terms the various informational, contracting and agency challenges of care markets, and I can warmly recommend that you go to Bob Davison's talk in the next session, where he will give a talk with a fantastic title of Optimum Contestability in Human Service Markets, an Alternative to Letting 100 Feral Cats Bloom. That's a good characterisation of where we're heading. And what happens when you let 100 feral cats bloom? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the international evidence on that. One of the robust findings of research in the English-speaking world is that there are measurable quality differences between for-profit and not-for-profit providers, and that the quality of care is lower on average in for-profit than non-profit providers. My guess is also that the standard deviation is much higher in the distribution of quality for private providers, so actually higher at one end but lower at the other end with a lower average. So here's some findings from a recent study by Charlene Harrington and colleagues about nursing home quality in the US, and that illustrates this point well. You can see this is a quality measure of nursing staff hours per resident per day, and we've got in all the various kinds of for-profit providers, there's a lower nursing staff hours than in all the forms of non-profit, including the public sector. A similar, if you sort of turn it around, you look at, that's a sort of a positive measure. The higher the hours, the better the quality. Here's a negative measure. The more deficiencies or citations against the quality criteria, we see the same essential pattern. More problems in all forms of for-profit providers than in all forms of non-profit providers. Now, given the pattern of staffing, it's not in the for-profit providers, it's not surprising that there are more deficiencies. And overall, these results suggest that the kind of economies of scale and efficiencies in production that large private providers make are at the expense of quality of care. Results for Australian nursing homes are similar. We don't have the enormous quantities of data that come in the United States for reasons I'll talk about in a moment that aren't entirely good. But a 2015 study by Richard Baldwin and colleagues at UTS found that for-profit providers were 2.8 times more likely than public and non-profit providers to be sanctioned for a quality violation here. We've got some recent data on childcare in Australia, collected by the National Regulatory Authority. The pattern is similar here to aged care. For-profit providers predominate among those that don't meet the national quality standards and are relatively underrepresented among those that exceed the standards. Now, significantly, the data are available to compare provider types because when governments fund external providers to deliver services to vulnerable people, they've become compelled to oversee the quality of these services. And this is in line with the trend identified by political scientist Stephen Vogel towards freer markets and more rules. An extensive research on nursing home regulation in the United States, England and Australia by John and Valerie Braithwaite and Tony Mackay has shown that as for-profit provision has expanded, and this is a quote, in all three nations, the density of rules and resources to enforce them has increased, and this capability has been more centralised in national regulatory agencies. And this increase in rules has been driven by scandals about poor quality care. When a scandal happens, politicians respond by making increasingly detailed rules, and this results in what they call a regulatory trap. And it's a trap because the increase in detailed regulation doesn't solve the problem of quality management or poor quality. These regulatory systems are themselves plagued by a range of predictable and well-documented problems that the economics of incentive structures could do a lot to unpack. So one of the problems, and this is how it's framed in the Braithwaite's research, we can see an example here. This is just from the newspaper on the 29th of April this year. Aged care horrors call for federal audit overhaul. Now, this article is complaining about the ticker box accreditation system. So this is a typical form of kind of ritualistic regulation where it's more about saying that you've got the procedures in place to address a problem rather than whether you address the problem or that problem doesn't arise. So what happens, the Braithwaites argue, is there is a tendency for ritualistic responses from all the actors in the regulatory system. Politicians create more rules to give the appearance of being tough in a ritual of comfort towards the electorate. There's ritualistic compliance. The proliferation of rules itself causes negative consequences. It's meant to reduce arbitrary oversight by making it clearer what you need to do, but then there's just so many rules that you can't see to them all, so inspectors focus on a handful of rules, not others, and you get inconsistent adherence to different parts of the rule structure, and so on. Another general problem is that once you have a private sector that you're trying to regulate with rules, then as that private sector grows, it becomes a strong lobby group, influential in trying to seek to change the nature of regulation in a way that, or manage the development of regulation in a way that meets their interests. So, for example, we've seen strong resistance in Australia of regulation of structural quality measures such as staffing ratios, which in general we don't have except for in childcare. So another problem is that the providers become distracted by the need to document everything, and so that the care itself can be, time for care can be lost out for time for documentation and compliance activities. And all this is very expensive for care providers and for government. And it's usually underfunded and not done very well, which means that quality problems are not necessarily addressed. So, and look, I think it's really important to think about, how these real-world experiences with the development of poorly structured markets and inadequate regulation, they are they're the way things are happening, and the government doesn't seem to really pay any attention in its kind of hopeful ideas about competition and innovation to evidence that shows if you go down that road, you're going to get into trouble. But of course, then the headlines in the papers that we see all the time. We're all familiar with the reports about these kind of problems in marketised services, corporate collapse, fraud, high transaction costs, and the kind of profit versus care issue. Now, obviously not all for-profit providers have poor quality care or bad or predatory business practices, and not all public providers are good, as the recent case of the South Australian nursing home shows. But there is a clear and predictable risk that certain kinds of poor practice and organisational instability will be higher where the market design uses competition to allocate services between users, and for-profit organisations are actively encouraged by lowering barriers to entry. Some of the problems arise because and some of these problems are more troubling because of the issue of what it means to be a consumer in a care market, something we could discuss at length, and economics could contribute quite a lot to in the thinking about the difficulties of being a consumer as a vulnerable person in a market with imperfect information. Another problem, obviously, is maintaining quality. The more you use a kind of competition, user pays, that sort of thing, very, very high quality services might emerge for those with the capacity to pay, but quality is also likely to fall at the bottom end. And quality regulation is plagued with design and capacity problems. So this kind of falling floor and dualisation and general inequality of access to good care is a problem. And the dynamic effects of introducing competition in private provision are also predictable and troubling. Market structures evolve, and depending on the service, one or all of concentration in large corporations, fragmentation into lots of tiny businesses that arise and fall, and instability are likely. And finally, the marketisation leads to the emergence of powerful new interests in further marketisation. And I could just show you a welter of reports from accounting companies talking about the new dynamic private sector contestability, competition, more private provision, themselves getting literally billions of dollars in government contracts, promoting the government to do more contracting out and so on. And the goal here is a secure stream of public revenue. What's not to like about a heavily subsidised, much needed service as a business model? So, just to conclude, to go back to my title, there are choices for individuals, how best to really empower individuals and personalise services, which are the promises of marketised systems, are the ways that the Australian government is doing this in the areas of particularly aged care and disability support, going to achieve that. And for society, there's a choice about how best to organise care provision in genuinely efficient and effective ways that result in high quality and a high floor on quality. The challenges are that a good care system isn't cheap and quality is hard to regulate for, so we need other strategies to do with internal organisation and incentive structures, among other things. The horse has also bolted in Australia, and how we get that horse back into the stable, I really couldn't say. Private interests are well established and very powerful. And there are contradictions between the stated intentions of policies to meet the needs and empower consumers and the nature of markets that governments are creating to meet these needs and intentions. And to some extent, there is a contradiction between the logic of care and the logic of the market. And we need to think very carefully about market design if we're going to address that contradiction. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Gabrielle. So, questions around some of those choices, challenges and contradictions? Just wait for the mic, thanks.
Over a long career, I've had a fair amount of involvement in questions about organising what can be called care services, broadly divided, and the relations between market design and it. And the one thing I've learnt is that the arguments about direct public provision versus via not-for-profits or for-profits or marketing designs, very often it's not so much that one is better than the other, it's that whatever you do, there are severe agency problems in all these care services of one person acting for another in some way, that question simply does not resolve. In fact, they may be unresolvable for all I know. You're correct, for instance, in aged care, internationally the countries that have gone the for-profit route get beset with regular scandals. But then, if you look historically, so do governments that have pursued government provision of those sort of things. It seems to me that an awful lot of the debate about this things misses the main problems in these things, which is not for-profit versus not-for-profit or government subsidisation versus government provision. Market design's all very well, but I often feel over a long thing that it's, you want to scream, but that's not the issue, you know. Have you comment on that? Or?
Look, just very briefly, I think market design does affect the incentives that providing organisations face. And that can shape internal behaviour. And I also think that the evidence particularly about corporate provision of care services is just pretty clear. So, economists don't often like to get the facts in the way of a good story about a theoretical account of something. But the evidence is, there's just pretty incontrovertible evidence that is a problem, and that market design is incentivising certain kinds of opportunistic behaviour. And so I think market design has to be part of it. But look, I totally agree with you that that care services need to be organised such that everybody involved feels that they're a participant in a moral community, rather than just a set of transactions or just doing a job or whatever. How you create that can, in theory, that could be created in any kind of organisation, and perhaps in any really good care provider that is there, whether you call it clinical leadership or whatever you might want to call it. But in general, I think market design does assist or restrict the capacity for that to emerge. I don't think they're orthogonal dimensions of the issue.
Thanks for that presentation, Gabrielle. I'd be interested in your thoughts about what you think governments should do about this. I guess my own thoughts are, it's about the capacity of the public service and regulators to design these markets. Sometimes policy is made on the run. There are occurrences where, the vet market design, done in very short turnarounds, or around how governments contract and procure these things as well. I think there are a lot of governments now moving away from funding by outputs to funding by outcomes, and I think that's around social impact bonds. That's quite interesting way of
very
contracting
very
as
hard
well.
to measure outcomes.
Yes, I think that's the deficiency as well, is the lack of data, lack of real-time data, and I guess for competition to be effective, if you were to open up provision to the private sector, you need consumers to be well informed, and often you cannot tell quality differences quite easily or in real time. So I guess those three things combined in a more information, better capacity, and a better way of regulating, a better way of contracting, could these arrest the problems that you're discussing?
Look, I guess partially they could. I mean, this is why I really recommend you go to Bob's talk, because he has thought about these issues in a lot more, these specific issues in a lot more detail than I have. But I think the idea of, and Bob will talk about this, one of the problems is the sort of free establishment, low barrier to entry, let competition sort out the good and the bad, and all you need is, if you can just give the consumers better information, then they'll make a better choice, and the bad providers will be driven out of business. Sort of think, no consumer should ever have to, you cannot rely on consumer sovereignty to drive out bad providers. I mean, so there's a really terrible nursing home and 100 people have got to be moved out because we've decided it's too bad, we're going to close it down. So, look, definitely the policy on the run. I mean, that VET thing, that's just so stupid. And they are doing exactly the same thing with the NDIS, exactly the same thing now. So controlling entry is really important. Again, there's something Bob will talk about. But I think it just connects to your point. In the end, the market design isn't the whole thing. It's only part of the picture. So the sorts of organisations that get created and are promoted and that are to do with things that really can't be manipulated by improved information and choice, because people can't be exiting all the time if they don't like their provider. It just doesn't make any sense. A kind of recognising the idea of, and I mean, I call it a moral community or moral economy, that has to be part of the picture, and that incentives and work organisation bring out the best in people rather than the kind of competition and consumer choice model, which sort of brings out the worst in people.
Final question here.
That doesn't really address the policy issue, but sorry about that. Go to Bob's talk.
Thank you. So having had 20 years responsibility for regulating aged care, what's your alternative? I mean, so public provision of aged care essentially stopped, 80 years ago. Okay? Aged care has been delivered in the private sector forever.
Yep.
When the NFPs had a monopoly on it,
Yep.
it really went well.
Yep.
We had crap nursing homes and incredibly expensive nursing homes.
Yep.
I don't think there's any doubt that the introduction of competition between the not-for-profits and the for-profits improved both quality and lowered costs.
Yep.
So you're not recommending a return to no competition within the sector.
No.
So what do you see as the fundamental market failure which makes this sector different? You tried to explain it there a
Yep.
little bit about consumer lock-in.
Yep.
I think consumer lock-in's becoming less of a concern with the plethora of... Well, the hope is that with the move to more community care, we have
Yep.
less consumer lock-in.
Yep.
So I'm not...
Look, I mean, as Liz said, I do quite a bit of work with colleagues in Sweden where, weirdly, and against your probable expectations and knowledge, there's been a kind of massive flowering of kind of consumer choice and market opening there, particularly in Stockholm, for example. And if you are going to get home care in Stockholm, you have to choose from a list of 100 providers, and they sort of are like, AA aardvark sort of thing, so because you just look at the first page, because how could you possibly decide over 100 providers? And they give a bit, there's a little bit of information is collected. So I actually think the unlimited choice and free establishment and a million providers, I just think that just can't work. So I think some sort of, again, this is really Bob's argument, that having a high barriers to entry and then to known quality providers that the contractor has a trusting relationship with, and then having a collaborative approach to ensuring that the quality is high is a more likely to work than unfettered competition between multiple providers.
And the result of that was massive inefficiency in the sector.
What's inefficiency mean?
Aged care was becoming unaffordable from a government perspective.
Well, GDP is just doubles every 15 years. I just don't accept the argument that these things are fundamentally unaffordable. It's a social choice. If you want a good quality system to support people who've paid taxes their whole life and so on,
I agree with you. Politically, I agree with you. But
Yeah.
That's not a position that any Australian government finds itself in.
No.
Australian government has to, keep its tax take at 25% and...
They don't have to. That's what they think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what they think.
I mean, the trouble is that Labor got they got the imprimatur to introduce the NDIS and put up the Medicare levy, and then they start this ridiculous free-for-all that they've set up now that's just going to end up in a terrible lot of pain. So...
Okay, I know there's another question, but I'm going to ask if you can address that after the session, just so that Siobhan has enough time. So thanks so much, Gabrielle, for that presentation. So our last presenter in the panel is Siobhan Austin. Siobhan is Professor of Economics and Director of the Women in Social and Economic Research group at Curtin University in WA, so thanks for crossing, and I should have thanked Paul too for also crossing to the east coast of Australia. She's a member of the editorial boards of Feminist Economics and the Journal of Economic Issues. Her recent research has been based around two ARC projects, one on the Australian aged care workforce, which her paper today will draw upon, and the other is focused on intra-household allocation. So thank you, Siobhan.
And thank you, Liz and Paul, for all your efforts in getting the session together. Also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're speaking on. Okay, so my paper is on a concept of co-production as developed by Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom. Interesting links to Marilyn Waring there. Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize in 2009, the first and only woman to have received that prize. So another important woman in the discipline and history of economics. Okay, so what I want to do, though, is examine the usefulness of the concept of co-production in the economic analysis of aged care. A number of definitions...
To your own. This way.
No, no.
Like with the mouse, go back a slide.
Oh, that's my fault, sorry.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So a number of definitions of co-production are apparent in an increasingly large extant literature on the concept. And this is not surprisingly, given that if you do a Google search on the term co-production now, you'll achieve more than 250,000 hits. But the one concept of co-production that's used in this paper is the one that's relied on in Eleanor Ostrom's work, and this is concerned with the active participation of individuals who receive a good or service, if we like, clients, in the production process. And we can easily think of examples of this type of co-production in my own field, the field of many of you here, which is education, for example. We know that outcomes from the production process depend not just on our wonderful efforts and also government funding, but also the efforts of our students. So Eleanor Ostrom's model addresses this form of co-production. It's also a model of co-production that's explicitly framed in the language of economics, and also reflects the features of her broader approach to economics, which I think offers important new directions for the discipline. What I want to do is very quickly talk first about Ostrom's economics before outlining her work on co-production, and then get to the issues of co-production in aged care. So some of you, I'm sure, would know that Ostrom's best known for her work on the governance of common pool resources. In terms of her theoretical approach, she was an institutionalist, and she explicitly framed her work, her contributions, with reference to the notion of a hierarchical structure of economic and social systems. As an institutionalist, basically you've got the proposition that institutions matter. They influence individuals' actions, their preferences, their interactions, and ultimately the outcomes of economic processes. As a new institutionalist, we see that Ostrom, like Coase and North, conceptualise institutions as the products of individuals' attempts to find solutions to collective and coordination problems. They model individuals, they characterise individuals as being norm-guided, boundedly rational, and having multiple objectives. So it's a much richer conceptualisation of individuals than we see in neoclassical economics. As a new institutionalist, Ostrom, like the others, was generally optimistic about the capacity of individuals to craft institutional arrangements or sets of rules to address collective coordination problems if they're given the opportunity. And so a key part of Ostrom's work was concerned with understanding the factors that affect the ability of individuals and groups to achieve such arrangements, which led her ultimately to be favourable towards or emphasising the importance of polycentric governance. I'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. As a sort of a solution to issues of governing resources. Methodologically, I find Ostrom's work particularly intriguing. She deployed theoretical models that would be familiar to anybody who's schooled in mainstream microeconomics. She used utility and production functions, game theoretic concepts to create what she called thin descriptions of the phenomena that she wanted to examine. But when she conducted her empirical work on the causes and effects of institutions, she adopted what's been called dirty empirical methods, so methods that are rarely used in economics. She aimed for detailed understandings of the on-the-ground context and processes of particular situations, and to do this she deployed methods that were qualitative and featured the collection of highly detailed case study evidence. So in this way it can be said that Ostrom went for the middle ground by adopting the thin theory of economics and the dirty empirical methods of the broader social sciences. The general features of Ostrom's approach are apparent in her seminal piece on co-production, published 1996, titled The Crossing the Great Divide. It sets up a very thin theoretical model that features the simplification and abstraction of mainstream economics. Co-production is conceptualised as the production of a good or service that relies on combinations of two types of inputs from citizens on the one hand, from government on the other, and these exhibit degrees of complementarity and substitutability. There's a budget constraint affected by the level of government funding and the cost and price of the two inputs. The objective is a rational one about maximising outcomes from the budget. Changes in the budget and changes in price and cost of inputs influence the technology that's deployed. However, acknowledging that information might be imperfect, and more importantly, that the effective motivation and coordination of inputs into the production is not guaranteed, the focus shifts very quickly in Ostrom's work to outcomes that fall, if you like, within the production possibility frontier. And this is where we see the central role of the institutional context. So the research questions, if you like, become what institutional arrangements will maximise the incentive for agents to commit effort, encourage citizens' input, effectively coordinate the efforts of diverse inputs. Methodologically, Ostrom makes the obvious point that it's very simple to draw these diagrams and identify that institutions matter. But it's another matter altogether to specify exactly what institutional arrangements will work in particular situations. She argues that if we want to move on to this more useful stage of analysis or form of inquiry, we need to deploy methods and we need to shift methods, and rely especially on case study evidence. In Crossing the Great Divide, which you can go and read for yourself, you'll see that Ostrom relied on two case studies, a Brazilian case study of an urban water drainage infrastructure project where citizens collaborated with a public authority on the design and construction of the drainage stuff and with positive results. In contrast in this was a Nigerian case study around the issue of education funding, where there was actually an absence of parental input and poor engagement motivation of teachers and negative outcomes. So Ostrom's comparative analysis of the case study evidence resulted in her very tentatively identifying a set of institutional arrangements or sets of rules governing situations where co-production might occur that will heighten the probability of co-production and increase the likelihood of superior outcomes. And these are fourfold. So technologies need to be in place such that they generate a complementary production function. There need to be legal options available to the relevant parties, Participants need to be able to build credible commitments to each other, and incentives need to be in place that encourage inputs from both sets of parties. Okay, so nothing yet at all on care, but I'm getting there. So turning finally to aged care, data that we collected as part of an ARC project a couple of years back on the aged care workforce in Australia provides insights, I think, to the institutional arrangements relevant to co-production in aged care, and they enable an assessment of the relevance of the concept for analyses of care more generally. Our study was a large mixed method study. It included a survey of more than 4,000 aged care workers, as well as semi-structured interviews with 43 respondents to that survey. A number of themes were relevant to co-production emerged in the interviews. And we can link these to most of Ostrom's institutional factors, the 4 that I mentioned earlier, which I think adds weight to the value of the approach that she has sketched out. But the findings of our studies also highlight the often negative impact of current institutional arrangements on co-production in the Australian aged care sector. Okay, so turning to our findings, I think co-production is directly relevant to what happens in aged care. And I think we can make links between these ideas and the capabilities framework that Paul mentioned earlier. So care provision, properly defined, is an activity that enhances the capability of the care recipient and thus extends to actions that enable the person to be in as much control as possible of how, when and whether their functionings relating to mobility, nutrition, hygiene, etc., are engaged. So this, I think, actually entails co-production and ensuring as far as possible that care recipients feel in control of how and with what help they achieve their basic functionings. In other words, I think the technology of care actually generates a complementary production function that makes co-production highly relevant. However, co-production is not universally applicable to all aged care situations, nor should it be considered a panacea. And I think this links actually to Gabrielle's points, and I could feel Gabrielle's concerns, but I completely agree, you're spot on. Look, the range of tasks that were discussed by carers that we interviewed reflected the varying needs of care recipients. Most aged care recipients, by definition, have some form of constraint on their physical or cognitive capacity, and in some cases, the recipient's capacity is significantly compromised. Thus, some forms of co-production that are perceived as intrinsically desirable, such as formalised systems of joint decision-making, are not always feasible. In other words, if you like using the language of the economics, you know, there are important limits to the technological opportunities for co-production in some aged care situations. All right, if we think about, or what the interview data tells us about the conditions for successful co-production in aged care, one thing that stands out is that the skill of aged care workers is highly important, especially around the communicative aspects of care. Successful co-production of aged care, where it is possible, involves a careful balancing of recipients' needs and capacities with the achievement of specific tasks. As such, it's heavily dependent on the skills of carers in recognising and creating opportunities for the involvement of care recipients. The interview data revealed that to do tasks for a care recipient rather than with them actually represented a relatively low-skill approach to caring. So using the language of Ostrom's thin theory, we might say that the skills of carers can enhance the complementarities in the production of aged care and improve the outcomes from the care process. Another critical factor in achieving successful co-production is the availability of time to care and also continuity in care relationships. The interview data show that there needs to be allocation of sufficient time to care work, and the organisation of carers' work has to be accomplished in ways that enable continuity of care. Barriers to co-production, to the recipient's engagement in the care process, can be overcome with the input of skill and patience and time by the carers. The interview data revealed that. Continuity of care is also vital. Many carers who we interviewed mentioned the importance of an ability to read non-verbal cues, such as gestures, but also changes in behaviour and mood. And they needed to be able to do that in order to coordinate their activities with a person's care needs and to involve the people, the care recipients, in the care process. Recognition, including through pay, is an important element of motivation, not surprisingly. In the interviews, comparisons were all quite often drawn between the high physical and emotional demands of aged care work and the relatively low rate of pay, and these were linked to high staff turnover and low morale. That's been well documented in a large number of studies on aged care. Okay, so coming to the institutional factors now, leading straight on from my last point. Currently, the institutions of pay setting in the aged care sector fail to motivate co-production or reward the skill involved in this important process. Organisation of work hours. Many of the participants in our study emphasised organisational constraints on their time. They expressed frustration with the small amount of time that current rules permit for engagement with care recipients, and how this undermines the communication of care needs and care preferences by the care recipients. Many of the participants in our interviews expressed their concerns with the sector's increased reliance on agency or temporary workers. Agency staff were generally perceived to be technically proficient, but their ability to achieve good care outcomes was seen to be limited by their lack of knowledge of and connection with the particular person being cared for. Less prominent, but still relatively frequent in the interviews, data were expressions of frustration with the impact of accreditation processes on the organisation of care work. It seems here that the institutional context matters, because at various levels of the care system, it directs and rewards efforts which are not necessarily conducive to co-production. Some of the study participants also expressed their frustration with a perceived lack of authority to depart from narrowly defined tasks and time allocations, and or a failure to be recognised when they committed more effort than was minimally required. And I think that also links to some of the earlier discussions. So, to bring it to a close, might take just a slightly bit of extra time, Elizabeth, but I'll get there. Ostrom's model of co-production is far from perfect, but it does have the potential to facilitate worthwhile economic studies of aged care. Being explicitly framed in a language of economics, I think, has strategic advantages, and Ostrom was a strategist. Ostrom shows us both the relevance of institution and the legitimate and important role of qualitative methods in economics. she blends that nicely with the thin theory. I think there's plenty of scope for additional work here. At a theoretical level, care situations challenge some basic precepts of welfare economics, in that the outcome, the thing that we're measuring on the ISAQuant, actually embodies the value of the care recipients' active participation in the process. So how do you put the input into the output? That's an important challenge. I think there are links back to the wellbeing framework. It says again something about how do we measure outcomes when we're thinking about care. Capabilities are an important component to the outcome of care, and they link to the themes in co-production. At an empirical level, there are a range of other forms of co-production that can be explored, those involving informal carers and people in the voluntary sector. There's also large scope for investigation of alternative institutional arrangements that might be positive for successful co-production in aged care. Ostrom would point us in the direction of polycentric systems of governance. This is something about market design and how we structure regulations in order to achieve positive outcomes. Look, I would generally encourage anyone who is interested to look at the this important element of Eleanor Ostrom's work. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Siobhan. So we'll take a few questions and then release you for morning tea. So just Hannah's going to give you the...
Yeah, I would like to connect these two papers, and I take as a take-home message from the last paper is that market-based care provisions are in contradiction with the need, and it's not very efficient. And there are questions on where the market failure is. There is asymmetric information and power and so on. The care recipient doesn't have enough information as the providers has. Now, to solve this problem, this co-production thing came in, and what sort of structure of the aged care facilities would have this co-production that becomes very efficient? Maybe it's time to think over that question many times in many different ways. One possibility might be, how about a cooperative arrangement where the care recipients actually own the aged care facility and the providers are employed by them, and the decisions are made by the care providers, care recipients, cooperative. What do you think about this?
It sounds very appealing. Look, one thing that Ostrom generally emphasises is to bring things down to the local. I think is one of her one deficiency of her approach is that she tends to neglect proper attention to power asymmetries. But there's a lot that's very appealing in her argument, in her logic, that if people can craft their own arrangements, then you're likely to get superior outcomes than you would achieve under a highly bureaucratic process and something that's highly centralised. But there are fundamental aspects of aged care situations relating to those asymmetries that need to be paid serious attention to. So I don't think, in some ways I think the NDIS model, goes a bit too far that way. In the same way it says, we like the idea that people will be involved in managing their own care, so let's just let them try and negotiate that with the aged care providers. Obviously that leaves them exposed to, really large risks.
Just very briefly, thanks so much, Siobhan. It's incredibly interesting. I think that what it really strikes me is that the idea of co-production really cuts through or just provides a complete alternative to consumer sovereignty as whereas co-production is a form of empowerment, whereas consumer sovereignty, it just can't really work very well in this sphere. And so the idea that you work within the service process rather than exit from inappropriate providers and just take your business elsewhere as a way of having your needs met it brings that in a way that I think opens up the issue in a really interesting way. So thanks a lot.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it also, it implies that the person's involvement in the process is valuable, which goes to some of the issues that Paul raises, so that instead of us being the passive recipients of a service that's delivered to us and that we sort of contract for, we become participants in that service.
Paul.
Oh, thanks, Siobhan. I really like that. It seems to me it's even more applicable to things like I've been thinking a lot about mental health lately. So if you think about the output as being recovery of a mentally ill person, it seems to me that the person's engagement in the whole process is really important, and that co-production is something that is going to have even more force in an area like that than the aged care context that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But it seems to me the thing it captures a lot of the resource contribution elements really well, but the thing that I guess I feel it doesn't fully capture is the engagement of the person, which is going to be particularly important in any sort of medical application. It's really hard to capture that, but do you have any ideas on how that extra engagement element can be built into any sort of a model?
How can it be built into a model?
Incentives on both sides. The incentive to engage.
Yeah. So Gabrielle's just saying it's something about the incentive to engage. I think if I reflect on our interview data, the skill really came out significantly. We ended up using terms, and this is where Rhonda Sharp's work was really valuable as well, terms relating to reciprocity. So how do you take someone who's very reluctant? There was one story I remember about this woman who didn't want to come out of her room, but the carer knew that her coming out of her room and sharing a meal with the other residents was, fundamental to her getting better or becoming well. And through the story that this carer communicated, you got that sense of the carer just giving the person some time, being very careful in the nature of her engagement with the person, create that space for the person to feel comfortable to come out of her room and to participate and ultimately achieve, a higher level of well-being. So the skill, I think, is an important aspect of the input of the carer's skill is an important aspect to achieving the engagement of the if you like, the care recipient. I think that's true, isn't it, when we teach? So much of our effort is around trying to find that little thing that will engage the student and get them motivated, or with our kids,
Sorry, I am going to draw the session to a close, but invite you to take your question up with Siobhan in Morning Tea. So look, thanks so much, Paul, Siobhan and Gabrielle, for your contribution to this panel on the economics of care, and thanks for your contributions as well. Morning Tea's now served.